to meet all of you. It really is. And I am going to give a short presentation on the writing of this book that had just released called The Moonlight School, that is kind of a neat story, especially for all of you in Virginia, because it's not too far from where you are. It really takes place in Eastern Kentucky. I'm going to share the screen now and start this presentation. And if you have questions, go ahead and not put them in the chat room for Andrew to filter. Okay, let me see if I can make sure, get this large, which is always my issue. Nope, goofed, sorry. I do it and then I forget how I did it. Do you remember, Andrew? Is it there? There we go. Okay, all clear? Good to go?
All clear.
Okay, this is a story about an ordinary woman who led a very extraordinary life. And it's a story that really belongs to all of us, especially those who love books and love to read. Cora Wilson Stewart is who this book is all about. And she was born in 1875 in Rowan County, Kentucky. Her father was a physician, and her mother was, this is a picture of her. Her mother was a teacher. She was raised in a home that really valued education, even though it was quite a poor county. She became a teacher and then eventually became the first female superintendent for Rowan County, Kentucky. And I want you to keep in mind, this is in the early 1900s. This is the time when women did not have the vote. So you're starting to get an idea of this educator with a little bit of a different way of thinking, of pushing things a bit. One thing I find so intriguing about her as well is actually that she was divorced 3 times, twice to the same man. So again, let's go back to the early 1900s, and you've got this young woman. She's in her 30s now. The time is around 1911, and she is responsible for 51 rural schoolhouses, as well as a in-town school in Moorhead, Kentucky, and all of Rowan County. She had this idea of opening up the schoolhouses on moonlit nights to adults who were illiterate. So 51 schoolhouses. She had to persuade her teachers to, after teaching all day long, she had to persuade them to stay at night, and opened up the schoolhouses, hoped maybe 100 people would come, hoped. And on that very first night, this is a true story, 1,200 people came out of the hills and the hollows, ages 18 to 80, young with babies and old men, and they filled the schoolhouses. It's just the neatest story. And that's the bones of it. I'm not giving away the novel, which I kind of fictionalized the whole event, but it's such an incredible story. And you might be wondering, how did I find out, or how did any of us, learn about this story? When I get up early in the morning, I listen to a classical music station as I write. I try to hit a word count every single day. And there was this one morning, and it must have been September 5th, when the radio host said, on this day in 1911, Cora Wilson Stewart began the Moonlight Schools. And there was something about that I just stopped and listened. And then I Googled some more and more and more. And then I just kept following this hunch. These are the little schoolhouses. Obviously one's painting, but the one in the bottom corner is the actual one on the campus of Moorhead State University in Rowan County. And I kind of started thinking, this is a story that really is waiting to be told. So at that point, I called my editor and I just explained the story to her, and she agreed. And the next thing I knew, we had a contract in the mail. So I want to just give you a little bit of background to it, as well as the background of Rowan County, Kentucky. You can see where it is in the red. It's Eastern Kentucky, Appalachia. Where it differentiates itself from other counties is that it is a lumber county, not a coal county. And one of the things I do as a writer is I go to the US censuses of the time to really get a picture of what life was like, all kinds of great information that comes out of these censuses. And in 1910, we had an illiteracy rate of adults among the entire United States of 7.7%, which was about 5.5 million people. In Kentucky, the illiteracy rate was 12.1, so almost 2/3 more than the rest of the country. Rowan County, very hilly, very isolated, was over 25% illiteracy rate. That means they couldn't write their name or in any language. And probably it was higher than that, because this was not only super isolated, but they were not people who necessarily welcomed government agents coming and knocking on the doors. So it's estimated to be as high as about 1/3. So at the time, in 1911, time of the turn of the century, academics believed that adults could not learn to read or write. And Cora believed as well. They just thought there was a window open in childhood, and when that window closed, that was that. That was done. Cora accepted that as an educator. It didn't occur to her that could be different, until some aha moments just changed her thinking. This is all the true story, and I incorporated these moments into the novel. So the first aha moment that really pushed her thinking, kind of shocked her out of the thinking of the day, involved an old woman. This is just an idea I would have of her, named Molly McLaughlin. And she was quite elderly, used to come down from the mountains into Cora's office, and she would either bring letters from her daughter Jane, who lived in Chicago, or she would ask Cora to read the letter, or she would ask Cora to write the letter, kind of take dictation and write to her. And there came a day when Molly came into her office, and Cora asked her if she had a letter to read or write. And Molly said, "No, I've taught myself how to read." She actually bought a speller, stayed up all night long, days after days after days, taught herself how to spell, how to read, and how to write. And her very first letter was to her daughter. Oh. Okay, next event that happened a couple of months after this encounter with Molly. And it was a middle-aged man, and a mountain man came into Cora's office, needed something, and while he was waiting for her to finish what she was doing, she noticed that he was just staring at her bookshelf. And books were pretty scarce in Rowan County. So Cora asked him if he wanted to borrow a book to read, which she did frequently. And he turned to her with tears in his eyes, and he said, "No, I can't read, I can't write, and I would give 20 years of my life if I could." Well, not long after that incident, then Cora was at a school function, and there was this young man, a 21-year-old, and he sang the most beautiful ballad. I mean, Appalachian music is so beautiful and so full of stories. And when she heard just the strength of this song and the power of the words, she went up to him afterwards and said, "I think this could be published. Can you get it for me? And I'll see what I can do." And he just looked at her so sadly. He said he had thought up hundreds of such songs, but he hadn't been able to write down a single one because he couldn't read or write. So those 3 moments just suddenly kind of shifted Cora's thinking and just gave her this idea of thinking. I'm not even sure we had a light bulb at that time to look like that, but you get the idea. She set to work on this idea of the Moonlight schools. She came up with Moonlight schools partly because it needed to be in the autumn, when this was a farming community. Most of America was an agrarian society, of course. Farmers finally had time to spare after harvest was in. Moonlight schools, obviously the light of the moon was needed because this was extremely isolated areas, very dark, forested. The moon was critical. And it had to be at night because for obvious reasons, they worked so hard. So next question is, that's the basic bones of the story. How, and I'm kind of stepping out here a little bit, but how do you take this basic story that I heard on the radio that you could Google, you could Wikipedia very easily, and then take that basic idea and turn it into 85,000 words? Well, here's something fun that I love about writing, and it's learning something new. I started studying everything I could about the times, about the culture, the traditions. One of the first things that just jumped at me, of course, was the music, because music just has such a deep tradition in Appalachia. And it was fascinating to also discover something called singing schoolmasters. And this is a concept that came out of New England in the 1700s. And it's a little bit like itinerant preachers that would go roaming around, and they would set up for a while under a tent. In this case, it was a brush arbor. They called it a brush arbor. And they would, again, this was in the autumn because that's when people had time. And this was so much of a community event, because when you think that what little outside influence was happening in people's lives at that time, something like this was a big, big deal. They didn't have Netflix, obviously. And so these singing school masters would come through with pamphlets, which is how they earned their money, because they could sell the pamphlets. And the pamphlets were these shape note notations, which some of you who are musicians or have music knowledge would kind of recognize. And it's just a visual way of understanding what a note is. When you can't read or write, you can understand the music and how a note is held or short or on and on. So he would stand in the middle of, like, they'd have benches all around, four sides, and he would sing out a line of a hymn or a music or a song or a ballad. Then he would, and the group would repeat after him, and then he'd turn, and the next one would, and turn again, and the next one, and the next one. And soon everyone was singing, almost like, I don't know if you'd call it a quartet, but a duet over and over. And it just was really quite a beautiful way for people to participate in the gift of music. So another thing that I learned about, that I found kind of so much fun to study, was the dialect of Appalachia. And we have a little bit of writing dialect as a whole is tricky, because when you overdo it, it's extremely annoying to a reader. And if it's distracting. If it's underdone, it's so ineffective. It's such a missed opportunity. And a lot of times it's just plain annoying. So how to make that mountain talk kind of come into the novel in a way that was relevant and true, incredible, without overdoing it. One of the things I found so interesting, I think there's an assumption that an Appalachian dialect, or Southern language, in fact, kind of is ignorant or it's uneducated. And yet it might be surprised to learn that it actually comes from about 1400s of Geoffrey Chaucer's time, the great poet, sort of an Elizabethan English dialect spoken centuries ago. So I don't know if some of these would be things you've heard in Virginia, but here's some examples. Afeard, afraid. If something's a mite, it's a little. Book read means educated. Nothing never stop means unending. And then there's words that were sort of invented just out of thin air that are just unique to the times. Sigogling, I have a friend who uses that term when she was talking about a wall in her house was sigoggle. Jasper, it means stranger. Gown means all cluttered up. It's just so fun to kind of study that language. And again, isolated area, the language stays preserved. So at this point, now we're jumping back to Cora and how this novel was starting to expand as well. Cora's ideas for the Moonlight Schools was starting to take shape. She had this class schedule, very, very clear idea of how to use the time well. Monday through Thursdays, 7 to 9 o'clock sharp, 6 weeks, 2 sessions. Started promptly, ended promptly. She taught her teachers that everything was to be encouraged and affirmed. There was no criticism. She was very aware of the pride of these adults, how hard it was for them to come in and be beginners. I mean, think of us, and when you're learning something new, it is so hard. It's so frustrating. It's a terrible feeling to feel like you're not able to do something. I know that because I'm trying to knit right now, and I'm still stuck on the gusset of a Christmas stocking, and it's past December. But she developed really relevant reading materials for these adults, these farmers, because she didn't want them to start out with primers, and she didn't want them to have to read children's books, and she didn't want them to feel as if they were in grade 1 and 2 and 3. They weren't. She was moving toward what's called like a functional, excuse me, I'm gonna go back one, a functional literacy, where they were making rapid progress to be able to read and write really quickly. This isn't the first, these are, I'm going to show you 3 examples of curriculum she developed. They weren't that very first year, but this is the kind of thing she worked on. Country life readers, mother's first book, and then even a soldier's first book. So at the end of these 2 6-week sessions, Moonlight pupils gain the ability to sign their own name. I mean, what a powerful moment in a person's life as an adult to no longer have to write an X and you actually sign your name. I just think that is something that's very hard to understand, but what a moment. So they could do simple math, they could do letters, and they could read a verse out of the Bible. So the graduation point may move them from illiteracy to a functional literacy, just that basic, spark kind of taking flame a little bit. There was this older man that made this great old comment, and I don't even know who to attribute it to other than it came out of some of the research I did. Moonlight Schools has taken my community from moonshine and bullets to lemonade and Bibles. Love the sing-song of that. And in 2 years, this is what I think is just amazing. Remember, Rowan County was a third of the population was illiterate, a third. 2 years later, by 1913, adult illiteracy was virtually wiped out in Rowan County. What a story. It's just incredible. And this program was so successful that it ended up catching on quickly all through the southern states, onto Native American reservations and other populations that were more isolated, all grassroots, no government money, all volunteer. One estimate said that within the first 20 years of the program, over 700,000 Kentuckians attended the Moonlight Schools. It became the model for adult literacy education. And the rest of Cora's life was devoted and defined by her work as an advocate of literacy. She chaired the NEA Committee on Illiteracy, and she was chair of President Herbert Hoover's Commission on Illiteracy. She had this wonderful dream to eliminate illiteracy in one generation. And she might not have hit that target, which we'll talk about in a second, but I really believe few people in US history have had such an impact on education and on literacy. And she died in 1959 at the age of 83. And it's kind of sad, she actually died blind. She lost her sight, which is sort of a sad way to go at the end. But there's something about Cora Wilson Stewart that I think is so remarkable. She had this dream to eliminate illiteracy. And you'd think when we look back at 1910 US Census, where 7.7% of the United States was illiterate, you would think that number would be smaller and smaller and smaller. And it is really sad to think it's going in the opposite direction. I think if there's anything I have taken away from this book, it's to not end at the end of the book, because we are at a point, and this might be a little hard to see the infographic, but we are at a point where the latest statistics, 21% of Americans fall in the illiterate or functionally illiterate category. It is really a concern. And I know our country has all kinds of problems, but I think this is just one of the most critical ones. I think the prison population is terribly troubling. 3 out of 5 people in prison can't read. 85% of youth offenders struggle to read. Here's a statistic, Andrew, that will just horrify you. In 2019, 27% of US adults said they had neither read or completed a single book in the last year. It just breaks my heart. When people can't read well, they're not going to have books in their home, and their children won't be reading. And the cycle goes on. And there's lots of reasons for this. I can't, point to any one thing. We've got so many different issues, poverty and immigration, and like I mentioned, the prisons, and on and on. But it is really a troubling part of our country that we can do something about. And Cora showed us that. There is a phrase in literacy called "each one, teach one," which is just a great little catchphrase. And I think if all of us, if there's one thing to take away from this presentation this morning, it's the value of reading, and that we can all make a difference in our community. Just like Cora, she just started out with an idea in her little community with the people she knew. I don't think she had any idea it was going to get to the extent that it did. But every time you pick up a book, you're a role model to someone else. Every time you're in the library, when you read to your children and your grandchildren, I think there's so many little things we can do, like donating books to schools, and supporting local teachers. I have 4 kids, and I feel like I did a good job, but I think looking back, I wish I'd done a better job in just making sure these teachers felt so appreciated. I have a couple of friends who, not during the pandemic time, but they volunteer at the public library. I have one friend who works with a Chinese immigrant, a young man with an MBA from mainland China, who is brilliant, but his fluency in English is struggling. And that's one of the things she does. She just works with talking and conversational language with him. I think joining a book club is another way of just keeping people reading and pushing people a little and thinking. And I do have a little free library out in front of my house. I live in an unincorporated town, no public library. So this little free library, I've had it about 5 years now, and it's just the best thing. It's like a little neighborhood watering hole, and people are in it every day, every single day. There are books in and out of it. And I just love that that's, just one little way to make a difference. And I someday, I think when I have more time, I'd like to actually do more with prisons and see if I could volunteer. Maybe we have a women's prison not far from where I am. And I feel like, oh, what a difference. I had a librarian just yesterday or 2 days ago mention that in her state, when they are making prison planning, they are, this is so sad to say, even projecting out what kind of prison population they're going to need. They look at the local elementary schools and the reading levels, and that's how they decide what kind of prisons population is going to be. I think that's just, we can do something about that. We can make a difference. So anyway, that is just a presentation on Cora Wilson Stewart and her remarkable life. And I think just sharing the gift of reading is her best takeaway value. And I hope we can all just not take it for granted, because it's quite a privilege. And with that, I'm going to pass back to Andrew. There we go. And if you have any questions at all, I would be happy to answer.
Okay. Well, I don't have any questions so far in the chat. So I think I'll maybe get started to kind of get the ball rolling. But I'm certainly more than happy to field any questions that anybody may have. Please make sure that you do put them inside the chat window. You should be able to see that option on the very bottom center of your screen. Here in Zoom, there should be a little icon that looks like a, Snoopy, cartoon text box or a chat box. So just click that and make sure you ask your question. Fortunately, but unfortunately, Miss Fisher, you've answered a lot of the questions that I actually wrote down for you.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I think.
So I guess maybe like minds think alike. But especially, you made a point on education and literacy, certainly here with students and kids and whatnot here in 2020 and 2021. Especially with everything kind of going on, with, closures and, when do we reopen the schools, things like that, and even just general literacy for even adults. Can you draw any sort of parallels maybe with Miss Cora Wilson Stewart's life that maybe that we're kind of dealing with even now?
Well, I think she did not let circumstances stop her. She didn't let, I think she had this belief that when this spark is lit and the right things are, children are exposed, for example, or adults are exposed to the opportunity, they can take off. And I was wondering about that in particular. I had a character in the book called Finley James, a 16-year-old boy who just saw no reason to spend his days in the schoolroom. And you can see a typical young farming boy who is needed on the farm and has probably been in school off and on and pulled out and needed at home, and how humiliating it would be for him to have to sit up front in a one-room schoolhouse along with the second graders when he can barely get his knees under the desk. And he just was done with school until, well, actually he had a crush on someone, and that just sort of shifted his whole thinking. And he buckled down and started really focusing and took off. And I wanted to make sure that was logical. Could someone learn that quickly? And I spoke to a couple professors, actually, someone who had done her PhD on Cora Wilson Stewart. And I asked her if that was possible. And she said, it is remarkable the progress that can be made when the motivation is there. So in some ways, I think that maybe the lesson is not to over worry. There's so much worry in this whole pandemic and our children. And I'm not discounting that they have missed quite a bit, but I have a feeling they've gained things too. And we're never hearing a little bit about just even the sense of appreciation. I mean, wow. Can you imagine how much fun it would be to suddenly be in school again when you never felt that way before? And I think they're going to be okay. I guess when you look at Cora's determination, and I'm sure she had a lot of resistance, but she never let it stop her. When you think of her as a woman, first female superintendent, she later became the superintendent of Kentucky, first female, again, before the vote, before women had the vote, and she was voted in by a majority. Divorced 3 times, in a culture that did not take kindly to that. I think she's pretty impressive. But one thing I love about her too is it was always for the common good. She wasn't seeking personal significance. It was always for others. And those are my favorite kind of stories to find and read about. And I think she just blessed that county and blessed so many people's lives and changed them. I'm not sure I answered your question, but I kind of think.
No, I got a lot out of it. So you mentioned Cora Wilson Stewart. So I keep trying to.
I stumble too. Yeah.
So with Miss Stewart, you obviously chose a very striking character to have as the star of your new book. Why her specifically?
Well, in a way, I actually probably didn't make her the main character. I never went into her point of view, which is how a main character, really you get to know them so well because you're in their heads. What I didn't want to alter Cora's life in any way. I really wanted to respect it just the way it is because she's a pretty amazing person. And I needed, though, this will sound kind of funny, but this is the basics of writing. Every book has a love story. Virtually even war stories. The only book I can think of that doesn't have a love story, that is like one of these huge books is To Kill a Mockingbird. But then we had Gregory Peck as the lead, so it was okay. But it is remarkable how relationships are critical, and that idea of romance just pulls you forward in the book. So I didn't want to adjust Cora's life. I didn't want to I didn't want to mess with her divorces, the reasons she divorced. There was a lot of abuse and that kind of thing. So I created another character named Lucy Wilson. And Lucy was like a second cousin to Cora. She was raised in Lexington by her father. He had grown up in Round County. He left it and turned his back on it, didn't want anything to do with it. But raised Lucy very short. There was sort of a tragedy in their family life that made their home more protective. And then Cora pulls Lucy into her life. Cora sees what's happening to Lucy, that she's sort of disappearing a little bit. Pulls her in, wants her to help her with the Moonlight schools. And Lucy is completely unprepared for the poverty of Round County. I used Lucy's sort of naivety and all as a vehicle to have for the reader's sake, so that we could go in together and start to see what this county was like. Poor Lucy never been on a horse in her life. She'd always been in a carriage. And now she's having to go up and down the hills on a pony that she can't even control. That she goes into Molly's home and it's a dirt floor and they're chickens. I mean, she's horrified. And yet, little by little, she gets past the abject poverty and she starts to see the beauty of the life, the nature, the community, the way people take care of each other. And she changes and evolves so much. There's a love story with her. She has a sort of a triangle, and I won't give that away because that's kind of fun. But I've used that same vehicle when I write about the old order Amish, when I try to bring in a non-Amish person so that we're seeing this culture that's quite isolated from someone else's eyes. And by doing so, you can almost get away with more. You can kind of have this sense of just getting past the bonnets and buggies and beards to really start to see what makes these people the way they are. So anyway, that's a little bit of how I got around making Cora my main character. She is a dominant character, but she's actually not really the main character. And everything about her life is absolutely true in the book.
Okay. Well, I mean, you certainly gave us, a great women's history background on a obviously very striking character with Miss Stewart. Can you provide maybe even just a brief description of the new book, The Moonlight School, that kind of sums it all up?
Well, one thing kind of interesting is you take a book, that basic idea that was just so exciting, and I think you could have given that story to, let's say, 5 different authors. And I think each one of us would have come up with a different story. And it would have been, with the bones of that sort of the skeleton of the Moonlight School. And it would have been kind of fun. I'm not saying I wrote the most definitive, I just did the best of my ability in trying to recreate this magical moment of lives changing. I made a decision, for example, to end the novel as I'm sorry if I'm giving this away, but again, this is the bones of the book.
Spoilers.
It's a spoiler, but it's not the flesh of it. There's something that's going to pull you through the whole book. I promise. There's sort of a mystery that rolls through it that's revealed, and I think it's quite satisfying. But there's this moment at the end where I actually just left it at the night when the schools are full, that very first moonlit night. Because when I thought of the story, in my head, I can almost see it as a movie where, this full moon and people coming out of the darkness and making their way quietly to the schoolhouses. And to me, that was just the drama of it. I just loved it. But I have had people, one reviewer felt like, no, I should have really gone into all the lives of people and how literacy changed their life. And that would have been a great story. But I kind of kept it to the beginning of it and how Cora came up with the idea, the resistance she had among the townspeople, how she started working with the curriculum and designing it, and really had fun with it, bringing all the different characters into the story that had been running through it. But it's a standalone book, but you can almost could take Molly and others that are now reading and writing and able to protect themselves from documents that, there was a lot of lumber shenanigans going on because they couldn't read and write and their farmland was taken and things like that. So it would be fun to just almost see how it's changed things 5 years later.
Well, I certainly do like the analogy, though, as you just said, with the full moon kind of, behind the trees and everybody's kind of coming out of the forest. It certainly kind of adds that, seeing like, the light through the trees. Yeah. There's light at the end of the tunnel. They're coming out of that dark shadow, so to speak, of illiteracy and coming into the light of being able to have a little bit more of a formalized education versus just, working in the lumber mills. So I do appreciate that.
I love that. Thank you. I'm going to write that down because I think that's a great picture. The cover did a wonderful job of that sense
Yes.
of, coming out. So very poetic, Andrew.
So my last question would be, with all these great listeners here on today, and of course those watching, hopefully going to be watching here on YouTube in the next day or two when we get it uploaded, would be, how can all these listeners of Culpeper County and the surrounding areas help?
How can they help?
How can they help? Literacy, education, especially going forward. We're just at the tail end of the 2020, 2021 epidemic and episode and pandemic and all the other epics that you can think of. What can we do going forward, or how can they help going forward?
Well, I think that whole idea of each one teach one, and the sense of value of what happens when you pick up a book, both for yourself and for the modeling you're doing, and reading, reading to children especially, I think is just huge. And whether it's grandchildren or your neighbor's children, or whether you're going to a school to read a story, in story time, I just think there's so much that can be done, and it doesn't have to be huge. And Cora kind of showed us that a little bit of just, she knew the people that she was working with. That's all that's needed, is just to understand your community and how you can make a difference one by one. So.
Well, with that, one more quick thing on that one, just because I obviously got to do a Culpeper County plug. How can the Culpeper County Library assist even going further? What do you foresee us helping in terms of just as a functional library doing to help make all this happen?
Well, I have to say, I think libraries are remarkable. And I've been on book tours for example, I was in one in a coal mining community in Pennsylvania. Very, very poor, one of the poorest places I've been. And that library that was everything to this community, everything. That was the internet. That was the daycare, that was the tutoring session for kids in the school, that was the seniors. It is amazing what a librarian like you, Andrew, can do in your community with these programs you offer, by just reaching out. There was one librarian I spoke to that said they're seeing with the seniors, there's what she calls the digital divide, where older people are just struggling to understand this fast-moving technology. And some of the librarians are just there helping download papers, downloading tax documents, things like that. So I just think libraries are amazing, and what a gift you give. So I don't know if I've even suggestions as much as just affirmation. It's just remarkable. I don't think those of us who live in more cosmopolitan or urban areas understand what a library can do to change lives. They're already doing it.
Yeah. We actually do have one question from one of our viewers, and that is, do you have an idea for your next book?
Okay, so glad you asked.
Ooh.
Yes. Yeah, this is fun.
So I'll write this down now. Okay, I'm gonna get my book order ready.
Yeah, well, actually, in 2 months, less than 2 months now, I'll have the third book out called At Lighthouse Point, and it's a third in a women's contemporary fiction, though men can read it too. I don't mean to say they couldn't at all. And it's the third in the Three Sisters Island series. There's three sisters and their dad, and each of the sisters has taken a role on stage as the main character, which has been kind of fun, studying birth order and all that. And it's the youngest sister's turn to finally have a chance. So that's called At Lighthouse Point. But what I'm working on, so there's the funny thing about writing is you're writing 50% of the time, you're promoting and marketing 50% of the time as well. And so that's kind of my promotion hat. But what I'm creatively writing, getting up early in the morning and listening to my classical music station, is a new story that will be out in a year. And it is set on Cape Cod, and it is about an ice cream shop. And the reason I chose ice cream is because my husband is an ice cream maker. He's even been to Penn State ice cream school. So I'm having so much fun with this. And it's actually been really fun in the pandemic to kind of have this whole different world to kind of mentally jump into a summer day on Cape Cod and ice cream. You can't do better than that.
Make sure you bring your golden spoon so that you don't, mask those flavors.
Well, and just to give you a picture, my husband, he's a serious guy, and he's serious about ice cream. So we call his ice cream Steve Serious Ice Cream. And he has made vanilla 59 times because vanilla is so pure, you can't mask it like you can. You have to get that right. So when you have vanilla at an ice cream shop, just realize that, because chocolate can mask flavors, the add-ins can mask flavors, coffee, things like that, but not vanilla. It's pure to the palate. So if it's not right, you'll know.
Well, I certainly want to thank you all for attending today and being a part of this. Ms. Fisher, would you mind if I unmute and see if anybody wants to ask a question directly?
Sure.
All right. So let me unmute all. Okay, you should all be getting a little message on your thing asking you to unmute if you'd like to. Would you like to ask any questions directly? I mean, luckily we only have we have just a few panelists here to ask open-ended questions.
I'll just make a comment, Andrew. I've just finished both of the historical fiction accounts of the pack horse librarians in Eastern whole country, and they were 2 decades later, basically, from Cora Wilson Stewart. And throughout both of those books, the literacy issue was front and center. In the coal country part of Kentucky. So I think the parallels are very interesting. And by the way, I read your book in 24 hours. Oh. I literally could not put it down. I've already read it.
Oh, Marty.
I checked it out of the library, whatever day this week, took it home, started it, and literally could not put it down until I finished.
That means so much. It really does.
I loved it. I loved it. And I want to know more about her. I'm going to check out the biographies of her.
So, Marty, you mentioned those 2 books, and I think what you're talking about is The Giver of Stars by Jojo Myers, and then the Bookwoman of Troublesome Creek, and I'm blanking on her name. Both really good books that were set in the 30s when the public works allowed pack horse librarians to go up. One thing I think so fun about that is I think of the impact Cora had on 20 years later, because those librarians were going places where people were reading. And it just thrills me to think of the impact of Cora silently making a difference up in those hills and hollows. I think it's so neat. So I'm glad you brought those books up. There's another one written even a few years earlier by Lynn Austin, Wonderland Creek. And that was one of the first pack horse librarians, but it's an excellent book as well. And then those other 2 are both so good and so different, but they came out at the same time, and they got a lot of controversy about that. They were,
I'm sure,
plagiarizing each other and that kind of thing. And they're very different books,
extremely different.
But both excellent.
Please repeat the names of those books.
The Giver of Stars. Okay. And I believe that was Jojo Myers.
Yes.
And then The Bookwoman of Troublesome Creek. And I think if you're going to read one, I would recommend that one, because it is such a unique story about a race of people that came from France and actually had sort of a recessive gene that made their skin blue. And they were called the Blue People. And it's true. It's a true piece of, I don't know if that was set in Kentucky or Tennessee. Do you remember, Marty? I know Giver of Stars was Kentucky for sure, but
the other one was Kentucky.
Were they both Kentucky? Yeah, but the prejudice that these blue people, this is the term colored people, and this is one of the race of people that were called colored. Isn't that fascinating? So it's a really interesting story. It'd be a great book club kind of conversation story and all, I think.
And the library has both of them.
Yeah.
Bookwoman of what?
Troublesome Creek. Yeah. Do you agree, Marty? Did you about read if you're going to read one over the other, or do you think both?
Well, I read The Giver of Stars first, and then found out about the other one. So, but they're so different. I think you can't go wrong reading both of them. And
Yeah.
the French connection is they were Huguenots, or a branch of the Huguenots from France that came to this country. And they were kind of kicked out of France because they were blue.
It blue in the sense, like, I think you know how when your fingers are so cold, they're almost a dusky, husky blue kind of color.
Yeah.
I think that's sort of what it was considered. But you could actually Google and see a few blue people on images, old images. So you know what I think about the book Woman of Troublesome Creek is that it has that historical truth, which I just, some of my favorite books have that element to it, whereas The Giver of Stars was more fictitious, but
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so fun to talk to librarians, book lovers. We could probably talk about all kinds of books.
I would say I don't think we have enough time in an hour for that, for an hour recording for that one.
Suzanne, your series is Three Sisters Island.
Yes, Three Sisters Island, set off the coast of Maine. And the first one is on Summer Tide. Second one is On a Coastal Breeze. And now this third one is coming soon at Lighthouse Point. And it's a story basically of kind of a father in his late 50s who realizes his three grown daughters, they're young adults, are growing quite estranged from each other. And he realizes, I have to do something to keep our family together. So he buys this bankrupt island off the coast of Maine. And there are many of them, like 3,000 islands off the coast of Maine. And his daughters think he's absolutely crazy. Like must be the start of dementia. And, but you don't want to count this dad out too quickly because something wonderful happens. I love the happily ever after.
Well, I can certainly say after living in Maine for so long, especially with some of the different islands and lighthouses, it does add its own magical component. That's for
I
sure.
know. It's almost like part of the story is just the setting is a main character. It really is. It's
That and a moose.
That and a moose, and lighthouses and that kind of thing. But of course, and each book takes place pretty much in the summer, so it's the best. It's not a bitter cold day, but the community, of course, is interesting to have the tourism and then the locals and the change, the little bit of the tension between the two.
So will that series be a trilogy? Are you planning to end it with a third book?
Yes, I think I'm going to end it, but I'm wondering, there's a little part of me almost wondering about like my ice cream series in Cape Cod, if I could have a few overlapping characters, just because it's all part of the New England area. It'd be fun. My dad's from Cape Cod, so it's a special part of my heart. And he went to Bowdoin in Maine, so I love that whole part of the country.
Where in Cape Cod, if I may ask?
He was in Bourne, which is right over the canal, so it's not officially Cape Cod, but my uncles are Chatham.
Okay.
And then, but one is in Chatham and one is in Cohasset, which is on the inside.
Yep. I was born and raised in Braintree, just south of Boston. So
yeah, special part. I
And
feel like you have a question. Go ahead.
Andrew, you said that you're going to have this on YouTube because I couldn't get on at the very beginning.
Yes, I'm going to have this recording on YouTube. It should be uploaded within the next day or so. And so this way you'll be able to watch it on any of your favorite streaming devices.
Okay, and what will it be titled? I mean,
I'll probably just have it labeled as Suzanne Woods Fisher.
okay.
And I'll probably have the image of the advertisement that I had out earlier as probably like the main image that you'll see.
Okay. I just
That should
wanted
be up
to,
within the next day or two. And again, you'll be able to, if you want to just watch it or watch the first half for, for whatever you may have missed, that will be available on YouTube. Just go to Culpeper County Library's Facebook page, just do a quick search for it. And I'm sorry, YouTube channel, and it'll be up there.
okay. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Well, I think then, unless anybody has any further questions,
Perfect. Thank you so much. So
Thank
grateful.
you.
Thank you.
I'll say thank you. This has
Very
been a
interesting.
pleasure, and you've been a pleasure to talk to even before we got on got to this call, and hopefully there's many good successes for you to come.
Thank you. Well, Moonlight just hit a bestseller list, so I'm really, really grateful. I don't take any of that for
Yay.
granted. Yeah. So just you sharing it and exposing it to your readers is a huge help, because this really is a story that belongs to everybody. So thank you.
Well, as soon as we can actually get copies back in the library, I'm sure we'll be able to circulate it a few more times. But not everybody can read it as fast as Marty.
Yeah, Marty. Thanks.
Mm.
Okay,
All
well,
right.
I hope you'll stay in
All
touch.
right.
Take care.
Thank you.
Likewise.
Thank you so much.